Hi, this is Yulia Latynina, and this is my YouTube channel, LatyninaTV. And those of you who speak Russian know me as Russian independent journalist, formerly from Echo of Moscow and Novaya Gazeta. And I'm covering right now Ukrainian war, and I enlisted the help of my good friend Alexei Sobchenko. So we'll talk about the war, or rather that just instead of a monologue, I will answer some pertinent questions. Alexei, where are you?
I'm here, thank you very much. And my first question is, of course, related to this enigmatic agreement which allegedly Russia, Turkey, and Ukraine reached regarding the grain export from Ukrainian ports. Right after this agreement was achieved, although we still don't know details, Russia lobbed its missiles against Odessa, exactly the place where the grain was supposed to be exported. What was the purpose of it? Why did they sign this agreement in the first place if they did not want it to be exported? What's going on? Could you shed some light, please?
Lots of things are going on, and first I would like to start, of course, with the saying that it's ludicrous to claim that there will be world hunger because of 20 million tons of grain unexported, 20 tons of millions Ukrainian grain unexported, for the simple reason that 10% of the world grain is being burned as biofuel, and 20 millions are around 1% of world grain, and it's just ludicrous to claim there will be hunger because of this. Not to mention the fact that well, we won't start about this, about other ramifications of this idea. So, from the very beginning, this idea of the world hunger was used by Putin as an instrument to attain his objectives. And he did attain some of his objectives because he wanted negotiations, he got negotiations. And I don't understand the motives of Turkish President Erdogan, who wanted these negotiations to make himself bigger than he is, to increase his status, to increase his value, which he managed to do. But I don't really understand the motives of the West, who helped Erdogan with this and who helped Putin with these negotiations. I have to recognize that Ukrainians were coerced to do this, because obviously they cannot say no to Erdogan, who is supplying them with Bayraktars. Especially this is the guy who stopped Russian fleet from going through the straits and conquering Odessa, because I don't know whether somebody noticed it or not, but 20 days before the war, exactly on the 4th of February, 6 big Russian warships, they arrived at Tartus, the Syrian Russian naval base, and they were obviously waiting there for the war to start. And when the straits were closed, this meant that these ships did not appear in the Black Sea. And this probably saved Odessa and Nikolaev. And I must mention that this was the single biggest contribution of any foreign country in the initial stages of Ukrainian fight. And that was the biggest imaginable possible blow to Putin's plans. And I would like to know that Mr. Putin, who was always saying that if the West should meddle, I will use nuclear, I will use my nuclear forces, that in this case, against Erdogan, Mr. Putin made no threats. He did not say, I will drop a nuke on him. He didn't say anything. He just swallowed it. Moreover, he swallowed Erdogan's offensive in Syria, which is very funny because, Erdogan is right now doing in Syria exactly, Erdogan right now is doing successfully in Syria exactly the same thing Putin is trying to do unsuccessfully in Ukraine. He's resurrecting a former empire. And Putin had to go to Erdogan. Putin had to go to all his demands. And of course, Erdogan is the biggest winner of this agreement. And basically, missiles at Odessa port is Putin's way of saying two things. First, that he does not bow to Erdogan that easily. So we'll see what Erdogan will do in return. And my best guess that he will do something very serious, maybe in Nagorno-Karabakh, maybe in Syria. But the other thing is that when Putin is destroying the Odessa port right after this agreement, this means there will be no exporting of Ukrainian grain, because there's not a single vessel, not a single maritime vessel who will go into the port where it can be destroyed by a missile, and no insurance company that will insure this vessel. This means that Ukrainians are getting absolutely nothing, zero, zilch, out of the agreement. They are not getting even money for the farmers. And Putin is getting at least something. He is getting some base for negotiations, and he's getting some sanctions being lifted. And this was his intention all along. Of course, his problem is that he didn't get what he wanted. He wanted a truce in the south, where he's due to suffer retreat very soon.
Southern Ukraine.
In the south of Ukraine, yes. In the south of Ukraine, where Ukrainian troops are obviously mounting a rising offensive against Kherson to liberate Kherson. Putin is quite powerless to do something about it. He wanted a truce, he didn't get it. This is perhaps his way of venting his dissatisfaction at the fact. This is his way of getting even with Erdogan. But as I've said, it was a major mistake to sign this agreement at all. For the simple reason that right now Putin is thinking that somebody will negotiate with him. He was blackmailing the West. Actually, he was blackmailing it under false pretenses. And he got at least some of what he wanted. This means he will continue on this track. This is a very bad precedent, but as I said, I understand Ukraine had to bow to the necessity of negotiating because Erdogan wanted it, and it is obliged to Erdogan.
Well, after this meeting, there was another one in Tehran where three leaders of the three regional powers, Erdogan, Putin, and what's his name, the Iranian,
Khamenei.
I presume it was Ayatollah Khamenei.
Yes, it was
met
Khamenei
together.
who gave Putin his left hand. Which is and Erdogan made Putin to wait 50 seconds. And I guess these 50 seconds were directly translated into this hit on Odessa.
But my question is, one of the reasons why Putin decided to meet Khamenei was related to the fact that Russia wanted to buy Iranian drones. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, and given, of course, we have already Turkish Bayraktars in Ukraine, but it sounds like this would be the first time when a European power would acquire weapons from a Middle Eastern power. Last time, I presume it was the scimitars when Russians acquired curvy swords from the Mongols, which were more efficient than the straight swords. And what happened, I mean, I cannot fathom, and we know, everybody knows that Russia is not the cutting edge technology power, but still to buy such an advanced weapon from Iran sounded bizarre at least. And then Iran said no, it didn't sell it. So what's going on? Why does Iran can produce drones which Russia is unable to produce?
Speaking of technology and scimitars, there's of course the composite bows that were also borrowed something like at least 4,000 years ago, something like this.
Well, it was at least before Islam.
Approximately 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, we don't know exactly, but this was an old. This happened a long, long time ago. So speaking of, first of all, I should mention that the meeting in Tehran, it took place before the signing of agreement, and actually this was what enraged Putin. And we just have to remember that in Tehran it was Stalin and Churchill and Roosevelt who met and divided the world between them. And obviously Putin meeting in Tehran with a local Ayatollah and with the current Turkish Sultan is not, it's not how he imagined dividing the world and asking for drones. Speaking of drones, he didn't get the drones, partly because of Erdogan, Erdogan's influence with Iranians, or rather Iranians' displeasure of the fact that Putin did make concessions to Erdogan in Syria, because obviously the Shia and the Sunni, they are not happy about each other's presence in Syria, and the fact that Putin decided to choose Erdogan, that enraged the Iranians. They also were afraid of United States' reaction, because the United States made it plain that if you give the drones to Mr. Putin, there will be no more negotiations, there will be some additional, the sanctions will return in all their fullness. And besides, they didn't have the full complement of drones because Putin was asking for 300 of them, and they don't have 300 drones. That's like 100, and it's a fairly sophisticated drone because it's based on a Predator that went down somewhere in Iranian desert. The Iranians claim that they shot it down, but actually it was some minor dysfunction or whatever. But it's worth noting really that Russia has no attack drones worth mentioning of its own, and it's a story of incredible military inefficiency and corruption, because Russia actually started developing some attack drones back exactly at the time Turkey started developing Bayraktar. One of them was called Altair, and the guy who developed it actually got arrested for stealing all the money. This is, the guy was arrested. It's documented. The other one was called Karsar. The money was also stolen. And the third one, I'm speaking of attack drones, was called Orion. I think it had a Rolls-Royce motor. And there were 2 or 3 of them produced, and one was even shot down over Ukraine, and I guess that's the last we heard of it. So there's no attack drones in Russia, period. There are some intelligence gathering drones. There's one that is that's used very often. It's called Darlan, and it's maybe we'll speak about it later. It's fairly good. It's numerous. It's been produced in big quantities. There's another one that was called Farpost. It was a joint Russian-Israeli venture. It was a very old Israeli drone, surveillance drone, that was licensed to produce in Russia. There was even a factory that was producing it. And as my Israeli friends tell me, it was shut down because of Russian corruption. The license is revoked, but probably the drone is still produced. It's being Israeli in its origin, it's probably very good. Of course, the biggest question is how happened that Russia, that was preparing for this war for ages, doesn't have, this piece of equipment that is absolutely essential and well, it is difficult to manufacture, but not that difficult. Actually, if we'll be speaking of the net-centric war, I should mention that right now, the most popular form of drone that is used in Ukraine, the one that has the wildest success, that exceeded all expectations. It's not even drones, it's quadcopters, civilian quadcopters that cost several $1,000s and that carry out their role admirably. They hover over battlefield. They were used initially by Ukrainians in combination with civilian tablets and in combination with civilian walkie-talkies. And there was a special program written for it. It was called Nettles or Kropiva in Ukrainian. And this civilian equipment actually did what Russian artillery was unable to do, because it coordinated very finely the artillery fire. And the Ukrainians, they were totally outnumbered. The Ukrainian guns were totally outnumbered at the initial stages of the war by Russian guns, like 1 to 20. And the shells were like 1 to 20. But the Ukrainian shells, even with old Soviet guns, went straight to the target, whereas Russian artillery was just shooting like it was shooting during the Second World War, just massive saturation bombardment. Ukrainians, they also did, actually they did have some drones of their own. It was Leleka and Furia. But the most interesting part I would just want to mention is that civilian quadcopters were doing very fine, and they had civilian operators. So the question, why did Russia not, first of all, follow the pattern? Why didn't it, purchase just civilian drones? That's one question. And the second question, how happens that Russia spent billions, literally billions, on different munitions, on different guns, on different, instruments of killing
Missiles.
each other, and yes, missiles, and didn't build the drones. And the funny answer is that I think that Russia has a very strong anti-aircraft lobby, and it produces all these Tors, Panzers, S-300 and other air defense systems.
Air defense systems.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Air defense systems, and the guys who are producing them, it seems they were lobbying very hard, and they were saying that all these all these drones are small fry. They will shoot them out of the sky. They are of no use. Will wreck their net-centric war with such things as ECM or our air defense, and ECM does not work on drones. Period. Actually, it does not work on military-grade drones at all, Russian ECM, and it works on civilian drones. But there are too many drones and too little ECM to be of any use. So it seems that it was a terrible miscalculation of Russian army, mainly caused by corruption and lobbying and inefficiency.
Listen, since we started to talk about the battlefield, I wanted to quote you the recent statement of the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, General Milley, who, answering the question about his assessment on the Russian war of attrition, said, and it's quite lengthy quote, "At this point, we have a very serious grinding war of attrition going on in the Donbass, and unless there is a breakthrough on either side, which right now the analysts don't think is particularly likely, in the near term, it will probably continue as a grinding war of attrition for a period of time until both sides see an alternative way out of this, perhaps throughout negotiations or something like that." Now, this is a mouthful, but do you agree with the statement? And if not, when and where do you expect a breakthrough?
Who I am not to agree with General Milley. First of all, I just forgot, answering your previous question, I just forgot one very important thing to mention, is that the reason Russian troops were not using civilian drones like Ukrainians were using them is very simple, that Russian troops are not accustomed to net-centric war. They are not accustomed to the division of authority, and they are not accustomed to civilians taking part in the war. because perhaps the greatest strength of Ukrainian army, especially in the initial stages of the war, now it's totally different, because there's totally different situation on the battlefield. But in the initial stages of the war, I would like just to mention one very important thing, that when I was talking to volunteers, they invariably described to me the same picture. The war started at 4 o'clock in the morning. At 5 o'clock in the morning, our unit, which did not exist because we were all volunteers, we were training, but we were volunteers, we started calling each other. We assembled by 8 o'clock in the morning in the courtyard. By the end of the day, we were fighting the enemy, and mostly these people were saying we were fighting the enemy with the help of these civilian drones. We were coordinating the gunfire, the fire of Ukrainian military, of Ukrainian guns. And this drone was hovering over the battlefield, and this was the drone that was used previously, I don't know, to shoot videos of marriages or whatever, marriage ceremonies. So obviously there was nothing comparable on the Russian side, because Russian army was all type Stalin's army, that is full of cannon meat, that is taking orders from superiors. And right now there are some some people try to imitate Ukrainians, and they buy drones for the front. And actually we have at least one case where the quadcopter, a civilian quadcopter that was bought by volunteers, Russian volunteers, and brought to Donbass, and it was given with a big ceremony to the separatists. And next day, do you know what? It was discovered. It was sitting in the internet being sold.
Wow.
Yeah, wow! I'm speaking about this case because it is confirmed. We have photos. We have we have even some inscriptions on the box that was covering this drone that were deleted, so not so just to conceal the fact that it was virtually stolen from the Russian detachments that needed it at the front. Okay, going back to General Milley. Yes.
He predicts a grinding war, like the World War I scenario, and then somebody is supposed to come up with the idea of negotiations, if you sum up what he said. And frankly, I don't like it, but I would like to hear your opinion.
Speaking of a breakthrough, I'm not thinking this war is going, as I've said, I concur. I think there can be some big changes on the fronts, but I don't think they will qualify as a breakthrough. For instance, there is obviously a liberation of Kherson in the cards, or maybe Russians will advance a little more in Donbass. Maybe, unlikely, highly unlikely, but maybe they will even take Slavyansk or Kramatorsk, but this does not qualify as a breakthrough. So obviously, yes, this is a war of attrition, but I would say that there are some major caveats, because usually in the war of attrition, especially like First or Second World War, you did not see much behind the front lines. You could get lucky, you could fly your plane, you could see something, you could destroy this something, you could bomb the cities, but still you did not know, online what's happening behind the enemy lines, or where the arm depots are situated, what enemy is doing behind the lines. Nowadays, we see that Russia does not have this ability. Yes, because when we see Russian missiles destroying the center of another city, or destroying another forest, and later reporting that there was an ammo dump there, so basically Russian side is just lying. And that's actually one of the biggest reasons I think it will lose the war, because Russian generals, instead of hitting real targets, they found the easy way of hitting whatever they think can be a target and then reporting that yes, they did hit a target. And war is not very well suited to lying. You know, war is the biggest reality check we have. So the Ukrainian side obviously has this ability. It had this ability with the civilian grade drones we were just talking about a little bit earlier. It now has this ability with HIMARS, because HIMARS, we talked about it last week, I think it was something like 10 days ago, because HIMARS have two very important, there are two very important things to HIMARS. One is that a HIMARS is able to strike at a target with the greatest precision, but the other ability, which is even more important, is that the Ukrainians and the United States, obviously, which are helping them here, are able to pinpoint the targets, are able to say this is where the armor dump is, the armor depot is, this is where the bridge is, this is where the railway bridge is, etc., etc. In order to do this, Ukrainians have the access to actually commercial satellites, not simply military satellites, but commercial satellites. And I think we discussed last week that this is actually another case where commercial technology has precedence over military technology, because Russia has military satellites, but their quantity and quality is totally insufficient to make this kind of analysis of the situation on the ground. And Ukraine has access to commercial satellites like Maxar. And the fact that there are billions, not billions of course, millions of users of this technology makes it far superior to military technology that has, you know, dozens of users or hundreds of users. It's just much more competitive, much more cutting edge civilian technology as compared to military one. So here again we see also once another example of net-centric war. And I would like to add another example which is very important, because what's happening also on the battlefield. HIMARS are very, you know, spectacular. When an armor dump is, when an armor depot is hit, you know, it goes up in flames, and you see it going off and off and off again. Yeah. But there's another thing that is counterbattery fire that is not often does not very often gets mentioned, but it's also very important because after Ukrainians got the panzer houses, after they got archers, after they got the guns that are connected to the counterbattery radars, they gain the ability to immediately calculate where a Russian gun is situated and destroy it within seconds. And this was absolutely extremely important in not simply disrupting all Russian logistics, like with HIMARS, but destroying the guns in big quantities themselves. And of course you can ask what the Russians can do about it. And basically there are two tactics right now that Russian army employs. And the first, I've already mentioned that Russia does have a surveillance drone. It's called NRLAN, and it's very numerous right now. And it's being connected in a sort of, also in a sort of program to a gun called Msta. And it's also quite effective as a counter-battery fire. A combination of Msta and NRLAN will destroy in 40 seconds any Ukrainian gun it will chance upon. So the Ukrainian guns have to change position in this case. They just have to lob the shells and just get out. So this is one thing that the Russians are doing. The second thing is actually much more difficult to counter. And this is what actually happened yesterday at Uglegorsk, where Russians advanced. And it was the Wagner group that advanced. And what happened on the ground was the following thing. That the Wagner group, these people, they are highly motivated, they get big money, and they are very good professionals. So they were advancing by small groups. They were infiltrating the Ukrainian lines. They were using mainly forests, or actually, I don't know what's the term in English, because in Russian it's lесополоса. It's a thin strip of forest between the fields. It's very typical of this kind of this kind of ground.
Is it steppe areas which are mixed with the forests?
No, it's not simply steppe areas that are mixed with the forest. It's the fields which are interspersed with thin lines of the forest in order to stop the dust, in order to keep moisture in the field, and so the fields are separated by these thin forest lines. And of course, they are very convenient for a small group of people who is hiding beneath the leaves, and you cannot see it with a quadcopter. And they don't have much in the way of guns, but they have mortars. And that's what's happening. Actually, it's a very old way to infiltrate the enemy ranks. This was first used by Germans in the First World War in 1918, and it was a very successful advance when the stalemate on the front was finally broken. It was first the German advance, then the Allied advance, but right now, actually, the Ukrainians are using it as well, and maybe the Wagners, they learned it from Ukrainians, because that's exactly the same thing Ukrainians are doing in Kherson area. They are not advancing with big quantities of troops. It's precisely these small groups of people infiltrating enemy ranks, and then Russian soldiers just discover that there are some Ukrainians in their midst, and they just leave the lines and go back, shall we say, without specifying exactly what they do. So it was exactly the same tactic employed there, except that and the Ukrainian troops in this case in Uglegorsk, there was some Ukrainian army which stood its ground, but there were some volunteers that were not that professional, and they just ran out of mines, and they just cut their losses and ran. So this is another way of fighting this kind of war machine, because Ukrainians, they still, this war tends to be fought by guns at a long distance. Obviously, by cutting the distance, by employing this tactic of infiltration by small groups armed with mortars and under the guise of the forest or a thin strip of the forest, it can be, on the one hand, quite successful, but you have to have highly trained and motivated troops to do this. And besides the Wagner group, Russia simply does not have these troops. And this is why it happened on a very, very small territory. Quite vital, but on a very small territory. Russia cannot really employ these tactics using all its troops.
Julia, what you said leads me to several questions, but first I would like to make it clear. Last time when we were talking about HIMARS, you were talking about game changer. Since the Ukrainians started to use so efficiently HIMARS and caused such a big impact on the Russian troops, did Russians learn how to cope it? Did they develop some counter tactic against HIMARS, or HIMARS continue to be this silver bullet which is killing the Russian war machine?
No, HIMARS, they continue to be the silver bullet because they disrupt logistics totally. Because obviously, if you don't have, if, like Russian army, you were used, we were just talking, about the tactics Wagner is using right now. And it's highly successful tactics, but it has nothing to do with the usual Russian tactic of massive bombardment, massive gunfire, that is destroying anything in its path, and later some cannon meet that advances. But Russian army is built to this, yes, cannon fodder, sorry. But Russian army is built to the specifications of, artillery, barrage, and cannon fodder. It's not built to the specifications of the Wagner Group. Wagner Group is very limited. And obviously by disrupting these logistics, Ukrainians disrupted the whole idea of current Russian advancement in Donbass. What happened still? Of course, there's some counter tactics. The easiest one is to stop building armor depots near the front and to put everything far, far behind the lines and to get everything to the front by trucks. Actually, right now, I've been told that Russians are using the trucks that are supposed to carry wheat. And actually, they do carry wheat. They have special trucks for wheat. So they carry wheat that was robbed from Ukrainians. They carry them to elevators. And they take off from elevators the ammunition.
To silos.
And they carry the... Sorry?
To silos.
Yes.
To silos.
And they carry them to silos. And the silos are also the sites where the ammunition is kept. So I guess next time a HIMARS will go into a silo, and the Russians will claim that this was a perfectly peaceful silo where perfectly peaceful stolen Ukrainian wheat was sitting, and the wheat will go on will go on exploding for several days. So this is this is something to add. Besides, since the idea of armor depots near the front is exhausted, it's not being done by Russians anymore. Ukrainians are switching to other targets, and the most serious target to which they switched are the bridges, especially bridges either over Dnieper. Across Dnieper, or across the other river. There's another bridge and another river called Ingulets, which is very crucial to isolating Russian troops that have gotten themselves across the Dnieper River and that are situated near Kherson. And now the majority of these bridges are destroyed. There were 4 bridges to destroy. 3 of them are either destroyed or damaged. And the 4th is of no big use without the bridge over Ingulets. So right now, there's another dimension to HIMARSes. They made possible the liberation of Kherson and the complete entrapment of Russian army there.
Now, Yulia, you several times mentioned this difference between the Ukrainians and Russians and the way they fight this war, and I could not resist but ask the very simple question. Both Ukrainian military and Russian military were begotten by the same father, the Soviet military. Probably even today, some Ukrainian generals studied in the same military schools where the Russian generals studied back in the Soviet times.
I should interrupt you. We had a very interesting case. I think it was a week ago, when with a difference of 3 days, 2 colonels were killed. One in Ukrainian army, the other in Russian army. They both studied at the same place in Minsk.
Military school. So what happens that Ukrainian army, which is definitely was smaller and poorly equipped in comparison to the Russian army, managed not only to to stop the Russian blitzkrieg, but even continued offensive and beating this allegedly number 2 army, the military force in the world? Is it Western training? Is it national character? or maybe this is a difference in political systems. What makes the Ukrainians so much better fighters than Russians?
One word: democracy. Because this is what we were talking initially, the fantastic difference between Russian army, which is still hierarchical. Do I pronounce it right?
Hierarchical.
Hierarchical.
Hierarchical. Hierarchical.
Which is still hierarchical, which is built on the principle: I am the boss, you are the fool. You are the boss, I am the fool. And which uses people as cannon fodder. And the other army, which is absolutely net-centric, where people actually, well, they do take orders from their commanders, but especially in the initial stages of the war, we simply saw people acting all on their own. We simply saw people doing what they thought is needed to be done. I can give you an example of one of my acquaintances in the Ukrainian military who was fighting against a Russian, how do you say топливозаправщик?
Fuel tanker.
Yes, against Russian fuel tankers under the place called Sumy. Because this was the initial stage of the war. They had nothing. They had no javelins, they had no in-laws, they had just their machine guns. And, well, they had some grenades to throw.
RPGs,
yes, they had some RPGs, but that's not a big thing, especially against the tanks. And when they saw the tanks just rumbled on past them because they could do nothing. But then they saw the fuel tankers. And you know, a fuel tanker can be taken out with an RPG just fine. And nobody ordered them to do anything because, you know, there were no orders, there were no, they just had, couldn't hear for anything from their commandment. But they just decided that fuel tankers make an excellent target, and they went on and they started destroying them, and they went on destroying them. And of course, the Russian tanks that rumbled past, very soon they were sitting without the fuel. So this was very typical of Ukrainian army that learned to fight during these 8 years. Putin was training it, because Putin was specifically training it in this kind of warfare. And the most fantastic thing, I think it's actually without parallels in the military history of the world. That
well, I mean, probably
when one army is teaching the other army to fight, it usually also teaches itself in the process. So the fact that the process was not reciprocal, that Ukrainian army did learn how to fight in these 8 years, and the Russian did not, it's really a great miracle, and the answer to this miracle is the only word: democracy. Ukraine is a democratic society, and it's fighting for its ability to make decisions for itself. Actually, sometimes it may be, a questionable blessing, because I speak to Ukrainian military quite a lot, and I think they are always thinking a lot of things. For instance, when these negotiations started about grain, they were just, they were cussing, and they were hitting the ceiling. And I had to explain to them, look guys, nobody's betraying you. Your government is not betraying you. Yes, these negotiations are not a very good deal, not a very good thing. But they cannot say no to Erdogan. They cannot say no to Europe because they're getting weapons from Europe. They're not betraying you. And these guys, you can imagine, it's as I've said, it's not a war with scimitars. It's a war with guns. The people are sitting in trenches. One thing they have in trenches is Starlink. And can you imagine, I'm talking to a guy, the guy is being shelled at this very moment. Literally, he's not exaggerating, it's boom, boom, boom. But he has his Starlink. He reads about these negotiations, At the same time, a Russian missile flies almost in, 50 meters, and he's screaming, I'm being hit by missiles. Who the fuck is negotiating with these guys? So I can see a lot of Ukrainian military, Russian military don't think this way. They just take orders, especially from those who are on top. But these guys question those who are on top constantly, especially since they were, they think they were sold out back in 2014, and they were sold out, and that's a problem. And I've said this is this is the other side of the medal. Being too autonomous for an army, sometimes it's still a plus, but sometimes a plus has a minus.
Well, it reminds me a lot about Israelis and Arabs who fought completely different kind of warfare and were particular initiative on the low-level commanders was a precious value of Israeli military, which helped them to win all those wars in 1948, 1956, 1967, 1973, and so on. Anyway, listen.
Absolutely, I just can, Alexei, because I think we just have to finish. We talked an hour and we talked half an hour and even more. And on this note, I think we'll just finish with this reminiscence about Israeli army, because when I was talking to these volunteers who assembled in the courtyard, civilians who went to war, I was absolutely reminded of the memoirs of Ariel Sharon. When he's describing what happened back in 1973, when there was a general call to arms, and immediately the battalions, the tank battalions, the tanks that were consisting of people who were long out of service, of the former militaries who were leading civilian lives. So they got into cars, took with themselves some food, and went to the front lines. And by the end of the day, they were sitting in the tanks and driving out to the desert, to the war. And that's exactly what was happening in Ukraine. And this is a crucial difference between the army that is called to war by SMS messages and the army that is being conscripted to the war by, general staff orders. These are two completely different kind of armies, two completely different types of warfare. And now, with the help of the Western armaments, I'm quite sure which one will prevail. So perhaps that's it.
I would have plenty more questions, but let's call it a day. Thank you.
Yes, let's call it a day. This was Yulia Latynina. This was Alexei Sobchenko. We were talking about the difference between Russian military machine and Ukrainian military organism, I would say. Biological organism, living organism.